Okay, let's get started. All right, so when we left last week, we're still discussing monopoly, and we talked about characteristics of a monopoly. We talked about how their demand curve looks and how their marginal revenue curve is different than perfect competition, and also how a monopolist chooses their price, and also how much to produce. So then, we started looking into the discussion of monopoly and how efficient they really are compared to perfect competition. So last week we talked about allocative efficiency. Today we're going to talk about this idea of productive efficiency. Okay. So productive efficiency is this idea of farms producing an amount of output where your average total cost will be minimized. Okay, so you're essentially producing at the least costly way possible. So this is not something that the monopolist does. So let's take a look at what the monopolist is doing. Okay. So if we have this price and quantity, we know that they face an upward sloping demand curve, and then I'm going to draw the marginal revenue curve, which is going to bisect the horizontal axis, from the vertical axis to the horizontal axis. It's going to bisect it halfway. Then I'm going to draw in the marginal cost curve. And we know that the monopolist will find their quantity by finding the intersection of marginal cost and marginal revenue. So this is how much they're going to produce, this quantity QM. But then this is not the price that they're going to charge, right? The price is not like at this level right here, but they're going to find the price by going all the way, taking this quantity and taking it all the way up to the demand curve, because essentially this is the price, the maximum willingness to pay for customers to get this quantity. Okay, so then I just take this point and then I draw it over to the vertical axis. So this gives me the price that they're going to charge. So they're going to charge this price PM and produce this quantity QM. Okay, and then we know that then we could just draw in the average total cost curve, which looks something like this. Okay, and if the monopoly had been producing at the minimum of the average total cost, right, it would be somewhere over here, which would be this quantity. So this quantity, we call this efficient scale. So this QE, this is called an efficient scale. This is the amount of output, right? If you were to produce this amount of output, this would be where your average total cost is the minimum, right? So if you produce this amount of output, your average total cost would be minimum. But of course, the monopoly doesn't do that. So they're able, right? So from here, what you can see is that QM is less than Q efficient, right? So the quantity that the monopoly is producing is less than the efficient quantity, okay, the efficient scale. So they have, the difference between these two numbers, QM and QE, right? The difference between them is called excess capacity. So the monopoly is able to produce more, right? But they are choosing not to, right? And the reason they do that is because if you were to produce, right, um, because by restricting output, right, by producing where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, and therefore charging a price, at your where your quantity, finding the price from your demand curve, essentially they can keep all of this as their profit. But if they were to produce where they at the minimum of average total cost, right, they would earn less profit, because now they're just producing at the minimum of their average total cost, and that they have to produce more. Okay. So by restricting output, they can essentially increase their price and earn more economic profit. And so they're not productively efficient. They're not allocatively efficient. They're not productively efficient either. Okay. Okay. Then, any question here?
No.
Okay. Then we have this idea of price discrimination. Okay, so far when we have been talking about monopoly, we have made the assumption that we have been talking about a single price monopoly, which means that this type of we have been, so far we have been assuming that the monopolist, they don't charge different prices to different consumers for the same product. Okay, so this is the idea of a single price monopoly, that they're charging the same price to different consumers for the product that they're selling. Okay, so but it is actually not the case in real life. We actually see this situation of which is called price discrimination, which is essentially the practice that monopolists and other types of um, imperfect competition, like when we will talk about monopolistic competition or oligopoly, we will see that they also engage in this type of behavior, that they will charge different prices to different consumers for the same product. Okay, so it's not no more they're no more charging, doing what the single price monopoly does, which is to charge same price to different consumers for the same product. They'll actually charge different prices to different consumers for the same product. And of course, in perfect competition, it's the only case where none of this happens, right? There are actually three different types of price discrimination that we talk about. One is first degree price discrimination, which is also known as perfect price discrimination. Okay, so this is also perfect price discrimination. Okay, so this is a type of price discrimination where a monopolist will charge each consumer their maximum willingness to pay, right? So if you think about, when we talked about willingness to pay, like way back, that it is essentially, right, reflected on your demand curve, right? So different person here has different willingness to pay for a product, right? This person has the highest willingness to pay, somebody over here has a lower willingness to pay, somebody over here has even lower willingness to pay, right? So what they do is they're going to charge a different price for each of these different people, which is actually very hard to do in reality, because for that you would have to know, right? For a person coming in to buy your product, you would actually have to know what each individual person's willingness to pay, like highest willingness to pay for that product is, right? So that kind of information is really hard to gather. You would have to do a lot of
That's dealing.
sorry,
Like that's making deals.
can you
The
just say?
price discrimination can change the price because it's the willingness to pay, and you make deals with people.
Sort of. So let's say, like, one example of this kind of situation would be a car dealership. Okay, so when you go to a car dealership to buy a car, right, and you're talking to a car salesman, right? They know that you different people, different consumers, different customer have different willingness to pay or ability to pay for a car, right? So they haggle with you, they'll talk with you, they'll try to understand what each person's, like what each customer's maximum willingness to pay for this product is. And then that's where once you have that information, then you agree on like a set price. It's not always the case that you pay the sticker price that is on the car, right? But sometimes you pay the highest willingness to pay, your highest willingness to pay for a product. So it's just kind of hard to gather this kind of information for every single consumer, right? So it's it works out with the car dealership because there's this one person,
So it
businessman.
depends. It
Sorry,
depends on the consumer, not the seller.
what do you mean?
If you're selling a car,
Mm-hmm.
maybe one will buy you the car for 20,000, and the other one will buy you the car for
Yes, so
like.
that right there, what you said, that is your different willingness to pay. So that is different willingness to pay, right? Somebody wants to pay 20,000, somebody wants to pay 10,000, right? So they're gonna charge, when you do first degree price discrimination, you're gonna charge each person their maximum willingness to pay. Okay, and auctions, also do this kind of things. You're actually letting them know, right? When you raise that thing, right, that this is how much I'm willing to pay for that. This is my highest willingness to pay for that product, right? Any question or anything that you're not understanding about this?
It's good.
Okay, great. So second degree price discrimination is just you charge different prices to different consumers based on quantity. So like you offer people bulk discount. Maybe if somebody is willing to buy a larger quantity, you are going to charge them a lower price, as opposed to if somebody wants to buy a lower quantity, they're going to have to face a higher price. So yeah, that's, I guess, what would be an example of that? So maybe if you buy like more boxes of cereals, you have it, you get a different price as opposed to buying like a single box of cereal. So I guess that's sort of like an example of price discrimination based on your quantity that you're consuming. And then the last type of price discrimination is third degree price discrimination, where you charge different prices to different groups of consumers based on their relative elasticities of demand. Okay. So this can come from, like age, um, income, all of these different things, where you can actually separate people into different groups. Because so if you think about the example here, so you see that with at movie theaters, right, there are different prices for adults, and then there are different prices for seniors. Seniors usually pay a more discounted prices, versus adults who have to pay a higher price. And also, if you are if you're thinking about airfare, right, business people versus tourists pay a very different price, because tourists usually book their tickets way in advance, and they're likely to get a lower price. Whereas if you're a businessman traveling, sometimes you are traveling, and then booking your ticket the night before. So that way you're always going to have, they're always going to charge you a higher price. So they are making, they're able to separate different groups of consumers based on how elastic their demand for that product is. So if you have higher elasticity, it means you pay a lower price. If you have low elasticity of demand, you are more inelastic, right, that you're going to face a higher price. Okay. And then some conditions for successful price discrimination is that farms have to be a price maker, right? So they can't be a price taker, right? So perfect competition wouldn't work. But all of the other type of market structure that we will look at, they have some way to influence the price. So, and as long as you're a price maker, or you can influence, like set the price in some way, you can do price discrimination. Okay. And they're also going to have to be able to find some way to segment those people, right? You're going to either have to find out what people's willingness to pay is, or you're going to have to be able to divide them in groups, based on their elasticities, right, of demand. And also you're going to have to prevent resale between consumers. So somebody paying a low price must not be able to resell, right? For airline tickets, maybe, right? Somebody who paid a low price would not. You have to prevent that person from reselling their tickets to another person who paid a higher price. Okay, so these are the conditions for successful price discrimination to work. Okay. So now let's take a look at third degree price discrimination. This is, we have a graph here, which has right here, we're looking at an example of movie tickets. So on the left, you have adult movie tickets, and then on the right, you have senior movie tickets. Okay. So as you can see, right, this is third degree price discrimination, and that has to do with different elasticities of demand. So do you guys remember what elasticities of demand, what, that sort of look like, any idea?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, so I was just wondering if you guys remember anything about elasticities.
I don't remember the exact definition.
Okay, that's fine. You don't have to remember definition, but hopefully you remember that it has to do with how sensitive or responsive you are, like, or your demand is to price. Okay, so for adults, right, they have a more inelastic demand, okay, for movie tickets because they have higher income. Okay, so if you're more inelastic, your demand looks like this, right? It's steeper, right? Whereas if it's more elastic, it means that your demand looks more flatter. Your demand curve looks more flatter, right? So this is elastic, this is inelastic. So this is what we see with adults versus seniors. So adults have a more inelastic demand curve because they have more income available, whereas seniors, right, they have a more elastic demand curve for movie tickets because of lower available income. So as your marginal revenue reflects your demand curve. So of course the marginal revenue for adults, right, their marginal revenue is also like more inelastic, more steep, whereas with seniors it's not the case, right? Their demand curve is more flatter, and therefore their marginal revenue is flatter as well. So here, we're just following the same idea. We find the quantity that is going to be sold by finding the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost. Okay, so this is the quantity for adults. And then the price that is going to be charged, we just find that by taking this quantity and taking it all the way up to our demand curve. And then when we dash it over, we find the price that the price for movie tickets that adults are going to have to pay, right? And the same idea here, the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost gives us the quantity for seniors, quantity of movie tickets, and this is the price. So as hopefully you can see here, the marginal cost and the average total cost curve, like, they look exactly the same, right, for these two groups. So there is nothing different about the cost curves. The only difference here is coming from how their demand curve looks. Okay, so of course, if demand looks different, your marginal revenue looks different. And as you see here, the price for adults is a lot higher than the price of tickets for seniors. Okay, so let's say if we charged seniors this price of adult, what would happen? Any idea? Is there any demand for a movie ticket at this price for seniors? No, right? Because the demand curve doesn't even exist. It's flatter, right? There is no demand for movie tickets at that price for seniors, right? So it wouldn't make sense to charge seniors the price of adults because they wouldn't be able to pay for it. They don't have any effective demand for movie tickets at that price, at that high price. And what would happen if you charge the senior price to adults?
The the adults will buy more tickets.
Okay.
Demand will increase.
Not necessarily, right? So if you the marginal, right, the marginal cost is not changing, it's just that you're setting the price, none of those are changing. You're just setting the price lower, right? So the marginal cost is not changing, the average total cost, those are not changing. You're just setting the price lower. And what that would essentially do, right, you're still because the marginal cost is not changing and the marginal revenue is not changing, the quantity is the same. It's just that you're setting the price, at a lower level. And so if you did that, you're essentially going to be reducing your profit. Okay, so maybe your price is still above your average total cost. Okay, but here, right, the amount of profit you're making, right, is gonna be a lot less, right? It's gonna be like up from here till here, and before you are making, right, all of this profit. So right now, if you set your price over here, you're gonna be reducing your profit box. Okay, does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so that's then then it wouldn't be beneficial for this monopoly to do that. By they shouldn't charge the adult price to seniors, and they shouldn't charge the senior price to adults. So by charging two different groups two different prices, they're essentially able to charge each group their maximum willingness to pay. So adults are paying their maximum willingness to pay, and then seniors pay what their maximum willingness to pay is. Okay, so by doing this, like by doing this price discrimination, they're actually able to earn more profit than if they charged a single price for both of these groups. Okay. Okay, so now we have we're gonna talk a little bit about this our discussion of natural monopoly. We briefly touched upon this when we talked about barriers to entry, what kind of barriers to entry there are in monopoly markets. Okay, so we said that certain industries are best if they are operated as monopolies, and what were some examples of natural monopolies that we talked about? Who remembers? Nobody? So natural monopoly, the examples that we talked about were, public utility companies such as, water, electricity. So these are the type of industries that are best served by a single firm because of this idea of economies of scale. Okay, so it is smaller and competitive farms are less efficient with the natural monopoly because of this idea of economies of scale. So if you remember economies of scale, we talked about this when we talked about producer theory. It is when your average total cost, the long run average total cost, keeps declining as you increase your output. So it is going to decline as you produce more and more. Okay, so let's say if you are a natural monopoly, okay, like you're a public utility company, like an electricity provider, and right now you're the only one in providing electricity in some city, or some neighbor, some big area. Okay, so the quantity, right, if you are the only one and you are servicing the demand, you're supplying the demand for the entire city, right, you're meeting the demand for the entire city. So the quantity that you are going to produce is going to be out here at Q2, and the long run average cost associated with Q2 is this one, the long run average cost, LRAC2, right? But let's say if there is competition, and another farm comes in, and they are also providing electricity in the same area, right? What that does is that the number of customers, of course, hasn't increased, right? It's the same as before. Right now, what's going to happen is it's going to be divided between these two farms. So if that's what happens, right, the quantity now decreases from Q2 to Q1, and the long run average cost associated with Q1 is a lot higher at LRAC1. So as you can see, so it really doesn't make sense for there to be two farms providing this service. And it would make much better sense, because long run average cost would be a lot lower if only one farm were operating in this market, because they can achieve economies of scale, right? Massive economies of scale, and their long run average cost is declining everywhere as they increase, right, their quantity. Any question here?
No.
Okay, great. So sometimes, though, the government will actually regulate natural monopolies, and we will see why, because the type of markets or the type of industries that become natural monopolies, or that have this characteristic of natural monopoly, are usually essential services like electricity or water, which is essential, right, for our everyday life. So sometimes the government will actually regulate these natural monopolies. They'll come in and they will intervene in their market, and here is why. Okay, so if we have a natural monopoly which is unregulated, which means that the government is letting them run their course, and they're not intervening yet. So with an unregulated monopoly, okay, so this is their demand curve, right, which is the same. This is the marginal revenue, okay, and this is their marginal cost curve. And we know that the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost is the quantity that they're going to produce. And the price, of course, you just take this quantity and take it all the way up to the demand curve, and when you dash it over, you get the price. So PA is the price that the unregulated monopoly will charge, and then QA is the quantity that they will produce. Okay, so the price, as you can imagine, this is a really high price, and the quantity that they're producing is quite low. And imagine that this is a service, which is essential to everybody, right? Electricity. So they're probably not really reaching as many customers as the government would like, right? This is not socially optimal, right? So what the government does, and of course, I forgot to mention the average real cost curve. As you can see, the average real cost curve looks like this. It is a lot more stretched out than we have seen previously, right? The minimum of average real cost curve doesn't occur until at a very big quantity. So at a quantity which is a lot higher, this is where the minimum of average real cost is achieved. And in over here, you see that the average real cost is still declining. So this is exemplary of a characteristic of a natural monopoly, right? That their average real cost is declining, as it intersects the demand curve. So it is still declining. Okay. So if this is an unregulated monopoly, as I was saying, right, they're producing QA, they're charging a price PA, but this is not really socially optimal, right? So the government will come in and they'll be say like, hey, natural monopoly, hold on a minute, you're not producing as much as we would like you to. You're not really providing electricity to as many people as we would like to. So here is what you're gonna do. They're gonna come in and set a price equal to PC. Okay, so which is when the marginal cost is equal to demand. Okay, so this is when D is equal to marginal cost, which is equal to P, right? So this is the socially optimal price. And when you take this price and then label it down, right, this is the amount of quantity that we would like you to produce, and this is a socially optimal quantity. Okay, so this is great for society, because now they're charging a lower price, and they're making they're producing a quantity which is a lot higher than before, like a lot higher than QA. But what do you notice about this price? Is it higher or lower than the average total cost? This price of PC. So if they're producing QC, isn't it the case that their average total cost of producing QC is higher than the price? Do you guys see that?
Yes.
So at QC, right, this is the price, this is the level of price. So I know it's with this graph, it's not very visible, but you can see there's a little bit of a gap where the average total cost of producing QC would be somewhere over here, right? So they would be making, even if it's a little bit, they'll be making a loss, right? If the government comes in and sets this price of PC for them and this quantity of QC, okay, they're gonna be like, okay, government, you made us do this, but look what you're doing to us. You're having us, we're making losses. We're not gonna be able to survive, and that's not great either, right? Because if the monopoly, they're a national monopoly, and they're the only one providing this service in this neighborhood, in the long run, they'll go out of business, and that's never good. Who's gonna be, for someone else to come in and have this kind of economies of scale? It takes a long time, right? So what the government can do in this kind of instances, and what they probably do, is give them subsidies. Okay, so they provide subsidies to make up for this loss. So hopefully you remember, when you give someone a subsidy, you lower their marginal cost, and you also lower their average total cost, and therefore, they would probably not be making any losses anymore. Okay, but of course, giving subsidies means that the government is gonna have to use tax revenues, right? The tax that they collect from people like us, to provide subsidies to this kind of a natural monopoly. So there are advantages, but then there are also drawbacks to this kind of situation. So this is one way that the government tries to regulate a monopoly, which is, this one is called the marginal cost pricing, because this is where your price is equal to your marginal cost, right? Your demand is equal to your marginal cost, which is also equal to your price. Okay, any question?
No.
Okay. And then there is one other way that the government tries to regulate a monopoly, and this one is called a fair return pricing. Okay, and this is when the government doesn't tell them to make their price equal to marginal cost, but then they'll tell them to charge, or they'll set a price which is equal to the average total cost. Okay, so and then they're essentially gonna have them make a normal profit. Okay, so same graph as the last one, right? This is your demand, this is your marginal revenue. Demand, marginal revenue. If the unregulated monopoly, right, would produce a quantity QA at the intersection of MC and MR, and they would charge a price PA, right? By going, taking this QA all the way to their demand curve and then dashing it over. This PA and this QA is what the unregulated monopoly would produce and charge, right? But if now we are trying to regulate this monopoly, this time with fair return pricing, the government will tell them that we want you to set your price, this price PB, equal to the average total cost. So they're gonna find the intersection where demand curve hits the average total cost curve, okay? And if you dash it over, and then it gives you this price level, which is at PB, okay? And they're gonna take this at this intersection. This is how much they're gonna produce, this quantity of QB. So this price of PB and this quantity of QB is how much they're going to charge and how much they're going to produce if it's a fair return pricing monopoly. So as you can see from here, if at QB, the average total cost, right, of producing QB is this much, and then this is how much quantity they're going to produce. So total revenue here is going to equal to total cost. And then what does that mean for us? Do they have profit, loss, or what? What would they have, you guys?
The profit.
Profit?
The profit is this, right? This square, right?
So that square is actually P times Q, remember? P times Q, that's your total revenue. Yes? And total cost is, this is how much your average total cost is, this length, this height, and then times this QB, right? That would be your total cost. So total cost and total revenue here are actually the same amount, PB times this QB, because they're the same, right? Because you are essentially coming in as a government and telling them that you are going to charge a price which is no longer PA, but I want you to charge a price equal to your average total cost. Okay, so then they are going to charge this price PB, which makes them have zero economic profit, because profit is total revenue minus total cost, and if they're equal to each other, of course you have zero economic profit or normal profit. So in this case, this is different than the marginal cost pricing, because there you were making losses because your price, right, was lower than your average total cost, but here your price is equal to your average total cost. So they're at least letting you have a normal profit, okay? Whereas with marginal cost pricing, you were making losses, and the government would actually have to provide you some money, right, subsidy, in order that you're not making losses. Okay, how are we feeling?
Good.
Good. Do you guys have any questions? We have finished our discussion of monopoly. Do you have any question? We still have a few minutes.
One question.
Yeah.
In this graph, there's no negative value.
What do you
like
mean?
There's no loss.
No. So they're not making loss, right? Because here if I put this together, so let's say, okay, let me take off some things. It's kind of hard to see from here. So if I put them together, maybe you would be able to understand better. Okay. So this is the fair return pricing. Okay. So this is when they're at least making a normal profit. So if you remember back to what the marginal cost pricing was, that price was over here, where marginal cost intersects demand. So that price would be like here. So this is, let's say this is P marginal cost. Remember, we talked about two different ways that they regulate monopoly. So this PB is fair return pricing, fair return, PB, where demand is equal to average total cost. And then this one is where demand crosses, right, and where demand and marginal cost intersects. Okay, so this would be the quantity for marginal cost pricing, and this quantity which is less than the fair return pricing quantity, and then this price is also lower. So this is why with marginal cost pricing, you see that because the price is lower than the average total cost, okay, so that's why they have losses here, but not with the fair return prices. There is no loss, right? But of course, they're making zero economic profit. Does that answer your question, Moment?
Yes.
Okay. Patricia, do you have any questions? Hello?
Hello?
Yeah.
No, I don't have questions.
Okay, great. Okay, all right. If you don't have any more questions, yeah, I guess we are done with our discussion on Monopoly. So thank you all, and I will see you next week.
All right.
Bye, thank
All right,
you.
bye-bye. Take care.